No, I feel like waking up these days in America is kind of a nightmare. Waking up every day in a pandemic of unprecedented proportions, the likes of which most of us have never seen in our lifetimes, combined with the worst economic crisis in almost any of our lifetimes, combined with the relentless drumbeat on the news, repeated murders of Black people by law enforcement, alongside the repeated, well-publicized instances of white people calling the police on Black people for basically no reason, and essentially threatening to have them killed over and over again. There is a connection in this country between white supremacy culture and the deaths of Black people at the hands of police. And now, these days, we're waking up each morning to civil unrest sweeping the nation, uprisings against police forces in so many different states, followed then by widespread violent crackdowns by those police forces. The National Guard called in state after state. I used to live overseas, and so when something big happens in America, it's my practice to check foreign news services to see how it's being reported there. And it has been, it's a kind of horror to see the situation here described in ways that I'm used to only seeing other countries described, right? Places not here, places far from here. Widespread violence and unrest sweeps the United States. Our country is burning and it feels like a nightmare. I wanted to talk to you in this time of confusion, of misinformation, of uncertainty that we're living through. I wanted to talk to you about confusion and uncertainty because things are developing so fast that sometimes it's unclear what's real, what's a hoax, what we should believe, and what as religious people we should do, if anything, with all of these confusing signals. Is rioting good? Is rioting bad? Is violence justified when it's done by the oppressed who are fighting to liberate themselves, as we saw at Stonewall? Or is violence never okay and everyone should desist? What if the riots aren't actually being caused by oppressed people? What if it's a false flag operation? The president has implied that the protests aren't real and that all the protesters are being paid by the left. That we know is a lie. But there are smaller untruths. In Minneapolis, the mayor said that every single person arrested for rioting was from out of state. The governor doubled down, saying about 80% of the protesters were outsiders, implying that the protests weren't organic or legitimate. They weren't real. I like to think that the difference between a lie and an untruth is whether or not you intend to deceive. But it's not really clear in this case. What is clear, the truth is, because this is publicly accessible information, most of those arrested do have Minnesota addresses. The protests are organic. They're being done by people who live in each city where they're taking place. Now, videos have shown that most of the fires being set, most of the windows being smashed, those are being perpetrated by white people. That's something we should all be aware of. Black Lives Matter organizers here in Eugene have begged people not to destroy property. And it's been happening. The Facebook page for today's protest, which I'll be at, has descended into a pit of infighting. Not strictly along racial lines, but often. Meanwhile, other activists, including Black activists, point out that the destruction of property is actually a very effective way of forcing change. You may have seen the refrain if you're active on social media over and over: riots work. In many cities, multiple competing protests have sprung up, some organized by white people, some organized by Black people, some explicitly nonviolent, and then violent protesters show up. Some explicitly revolutionary, and then the alt-right and white supremacists show up. There's a well-documented trend of white supremacists infiltrating all of these protests. And in city after city, white men wearing all black to conceal their identities have been recorded calmly trying to incite violence. Some of them have been accused, with varying degrees of proof, of being cops. Now, if that sounds far-fetched to you, it shouldn't. Agent provocateurs are a well-known, well-established law enforcement practice to discredit protest movements. Dress up like the protesters, infiltrate their side, and break the law to make them look bad. I have personal experience with this, having seen it a few times over the years myself. Not all the violence is being done by the oppressed. And yet, on the other hand, you may have heard activists, including me, pointing out, once again, in the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, that the riot is the language of the unheard, and that America might be missing something. You may have also heard, to add to the confusion, many well-meaning white people saying it doesn't do any good for them to burn down their own communities. And if you've had those thoughts, I understand, and I would ask that you reconsider, because I would counter that Target is not anybody's community. AutoZone is not anybody's community. They are corporations. They're corporations that have put smaller, Black-owned businesses out of business. They're corporations that have long preyed on impoverished neighborhoods, forcing wages down, exploiting the labor of the poor, while forcing prices for things like diapers as high as the market can bear, while enjoying the protection of the police in order to carry out their business. It's very much tied into why people are looting, because for every image of a white provocateur smashing things, you've likely also seen images of Black people looting and stealing things. And I would say that in a society which has commodified every aspect of human life and put a price tag on each of our days, looting is absolutely a valid strategy. Martin Luther King wrote that, quote, "Often the Negro does not even want what he takes. He wants the experience of taking, but most of all, alienated from society, and knowing that society cherishes property above people. He is shocking it by abusing property rights. There are thus elements of emotional catharsis in the violent act." This is all tied together, and it's not just about the deaths of unarmed Black men at the hands of the police. People are tired. People are tired. The Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey wrote last night, "These are people who are angry, people who are fed up, people who are tired of not having, taking to react against American capitalism that has so outpaced them that they have lost hope. You can say," she writes, "nothing to shame them at this point, noting that in an America where the police can murder Black people with impunity, there's no moral ground upon which to shame people for looting." Our own senator here in Eugene, Senator James Manning, told the Register Guard yesterday, "The pandemic has shown us now that it has ripped away the Band-Aid, what we thought was a scratch is a gaping hole." He says there is a gaping hole in the soul of America. So amidst all this confusion about who's doing what, who should be doing what, what's effective, what's moral, who has the right to do what and on what grounds, what can we say? What can we say for sure? Well, this much I know, and it's true that I might be a shade more radical than a lot of Unitarian Universalists. I acknowledge this. But I think we can all say that policing in this country is out of hand. And the widespread movement to push back against it is telling us something important. At all these protests, police have demonstrated exactly the kind of behavior that people are protesting. Watch any of the videos in major cities and you'll see cops randomly pepper spraying crowds who are standing there doing nothing threatening, shooting rubber bullets at journalists to stop them from covering the police's actions, attacking protesters for merely insulting them, forming unbreakable phalanxes to to advance on unarmed citizens. This is happening in our country. Our country has been occupied. No other country in the world is policed the way ours is. This we know, except perhaps North Korea. Nowhere in the world is a citizen more likely to be kidnapped by state agents and locked in a cage for the rest of their life, no matter what color they are, but especially in America, if you're Black. This isn't new. We've known this. We know that our police are more militarized than ever, that their budgets and their forces have swelled even as violent crime has been on a downward trend for decades. And while many well-meaning white people, especially wealthier white people, consider the police a kind of customer service agency, a kind of personal protective service that they can call up whenever they're inconvenienced, please consider that a numerical majority of Americans don't feel that way about the police. One of the best tweets I've seen calling for the abolition of police in America, the way we know them, American-style policing. The American-style policing where state agents just routinely patrol poor Black neighborhoods, beating people up and dragging them off the street at random with no provocation and with impunity. One of the best tweets I've seen about abolishing that kind of policing says that if you think there's no precedent for abolition, you need only consider the long-running case studies taking place all across the country in rich white neighborhoods, where people can live out entire lifetimes in peace without ever interacting with a police officer. It's possible. So, in this constellation of confusion and unknowing, of uncertainty and pain this morning, what can we know? What can we do? What's the best thing to do? How do we all move forward? And I think at this point, if that was clear, we'd all be doing it. If any of us knew, we would have fixed it by now. I'll say a few things, that I think this is a time for us all to exist in the uncertainty, to do according to our conscience, without doing harm if at all possible, to have faith in one another, and most especially to follow the lead of people of color, to trust them. And in all we do, whatever that winds up looking like, that we follow our conscience, that those of us people of faith follow our Unitarian Universalist values, and that we insist on liberation every step of the way. We can no longer pretend that things are okay in this country. And my hope is that what we're going through now, this painful, frightening period, is going to give way to something better. That it's going to give way to liberation, to justice, to a world that looks more like the one we have imagined in our principles, in our congregations and covenants. If you attend the protest today, please don't bring your children. Please keep yourself safe. Do according to your conscience. And your church will be with you in spirit everywhere you go. Amen.